This is episode 49 of the Get in My Garden podcast. This is Aaron Moskowitz, and today we meet Ed Williams, creator of the LEHR garden, LEHR, which is an acronym for the system he has created that includes elements of aquaponics, hugelkultur, composting, mushrooms, the soil food web, and basically as many natural components as possible. He is an engineer after all. Ed is very interesting to listen to as he describes his backyard systems, shares his engineering wisdom, and talks about the backyard farm he has created from start to finish. Ed's vision is for a more involved and healthy human interaction with the foods we eat, with fewer labor hours and much greater ecological and social benefit. Towards the end of the episode, he shares his calculations about carbon sequestration and his ideas for remodeling the suburban landscape norms. Follow the show at Get in My Garden on Instagram to see pictures of what we discuss here and to hear about upcoming episodes. Also visit getinmygarden.com and make sure to sign up for the email list, which will soon include supplemental and special content or freebies, as well as articles or other interesting things I share with my close friends. I hope you will subscribe to the Get in My Garden podcast wherever you listen from and leave a positive review if you want to support the show. Really interested in what you're doing. You have such beautiful pictures of your work in your yard on Instagram, and I didn't really know what a LEHR garden is. So do you want to introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about what it is and what you're doing?
Okay, so yeah, LEHR garden, it's actually not surprising that you haven't heard much about it yet. It's something that I've invented and I've been working on developing. I've actually been doing it about 6 years now. The pictures that you've seen on my Instagram are just, my second generation prototype that I'm working on building out, working on heavier on aesthetics and functionality and size over my first generation prototype. But basically what it is the oversimplified version of it is that it's kind of like aquaponics, but with soil. Now, the problem with doing soil and aquaponics, and a big part of the reason that core canon, if you will, of aquaponics is that you can't do it with soil, is that because if you dump good fertile soil that you're going to be able to grow your plants into aquaponics, a lot of the nutrients that the plants need are actually water soluble. And so they will dissolve straight up into the water. The water will get cloudy. The water will get dirty. You'll get what's known as BOD, biological oxygen demand. So the bacteria in the water will flourish on this heavy influx of nitrogen, among other nutrients. And the BOD, the O being oxygen, they start to take the oxygen out of the water, and you get a big fish die off. Mm-hmm. And the way I overcome that is I actually make the soil balance in concert with the water. So the soil, when I add it, is not soil. I add maybe up to 20% compost. I actually prefer just a little bit less than that. The rest of it's all organic matter, mostly woody organic matter. Huh. I saw on your Instagram, Aaron, that you like mushrooms as well. And mushrooms is one of the big tools that I use to make that work.
That is so cool.
So yeah, thanks. It's something I've been growing mushrooms for about 15 years now, and there's so much cool things that you can do with it. But there's a couple of different things that the mushrooms bring to the table in a system like this. The first is the body of the mushroom, the mycelium, works basically like a big filter. So the mushrooms are particularly aggressive about grabbing any nutrients that flow past them. It's a big giant net. And so the mushrooms actually help the absorption of nutrients from the water, help the filtration. They also get into the woody material and start breaking it down. So I'm using a little bit like hugelkultur techniques, which is burying large chunks of wood in your soil, but I'm doing it in concert with the mushroom growing.
And is it all connected so that the water and fish system is connected to the mushroom system in real time?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, that's so cool.
Yeah, but let me talk just a little bit more about the soil, but then I'll jump into kind of the structure.
Great.
The mushrooms get into the woody material now because it's large. I've got a good mix of small like sawdust and wood chip type material, but also a lot of branches. And if I have a system that I'm going to be growing for a while, I'll actually throw logs in it if I've got soil that's deep enough. And that'll give the mushrooms a lot of time to work on the material. You'll give them a safe place. Here in Phoenix, Arizona, summertime temperatures are highly not conducive to growing mushrooms outdoors. But if you give them a safe place inside a log, for example, to live and grow, then they can actually live through the summer in a protected location. And I've had them, live through the first year I did it. I planted a bunch of spent mushroom logs in my garden thinking they would just work on decomposing. And then fall rolled around, cool temperatures set in, and I started getting mushrooms.
That's great.
That was the first sign that really I was onto something pretty cool. So the mushrooms work on breaking down the woody material. Then the earthworms come behind them and they consume what's left. And then you start building a soil ecosystem that really does a phenomenal job of not just supporting the plants, but also filtering the water. So talking a little bit about the structure of the system, LEHR is actually an acronym. It means short for linking ecosystem and hardware for regeneration. The reason I think that particular piece is important is if you look at, a lot of people are recognizing that agriculture, industrial agriculture, as we're currently practicing it, is fairly broken. It's not a system that's going to be sustainable for a long time. It's actively using up soil. It's actively destroying ecosystems. It's actively taking the carbon out of the soil and putting it into the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people are looking at how to fix that problem. It's something that literally millions of people worldwide are trying to find the best way to come up with something better, and have been for several decades now. You have holistic management, you have permaculture, you have agroforestry, you have hydroponics, you have aquaponics. These are all methods to try and come up with a better way of producing food. But one of the things that almost all of the people operating in this space are doing is they come up with either the option that nature is the problem, all diseases and pests come from nature, therefore we need to get nature out of the system, which is where you get hydroponics, aquaponics, aeroponics, that sort of thing. Vertical indoor farming are all designed to specifically exclude as much nature as possible from the growing process. And then you have the people who say that technology is the problem, that industrial agriculture uses a lot of technology, and that's a lot of the problem, and thus we need to get back to nature. And they try and and that would be like permaculture and holistic management and agroforestry and techniques like that are designed to use the natural processes in a healthy way.
Uh-huh.
What I'm doing that's different from those is I'm saying it doesn't have to be either or. We can use the technology as a labor-saving device and bring the healthy nutrient channeling aspects of a natural system, and we can use them in concert. And that's the part that I haven't seen a lot of out there. And I think, to me, the really important part of making that work is to understand the appropriate roles. We tend to use technology to replace human labor, which I think is a helpful way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But we also use the technology to replace natural processes, which I think is not helpful. The natural processes, every organism that we've got has evolved in concert with those natural processes and functions best working in the environment that evolved to work in. And so if we can use the technology to reduce human labor and then use the biology you basically use the technology to enhance and accelerate biological processes, you get something that actually works really, really well.
That is so awesome. It's literally perfect for the mission of what I've been trying to do with the podcast, because so many people I know, they're using natural farming methods, which are amazing, like you said, but they're also not really thinking of how to streamline it with technology. So I definitely believe if we're going to fix our problems, we've got to use both.
Yeah. And I think that, a little bit, perhaps a titch off topic here, but, one of the things that as we try and create a functional society that's going to work with and not destroy the natural system that we rely on for life, we need to be a part of a part of our food production, a part of our ecosystem, and making sure that the ecosystem processes are all over there and we live over here in the civilized world is, I think, maybe the wrong way to do it. And so we need to bring some of these labor-saving devices into a process so that we can have the human beings doing what's appropriate for humans, which is managing the system.
Mm-hmm.
We don't necessarily need people out there watering by hand every day and weeding and, you know, doing all of these things that we can really have the machines do.
Well, even your systems, and so you're living in an area where nobody would want to be a farmer, honestly, like outdoors all day. That's impossible, right? Because it's just so damn hot most of the year. So
Kind of crazy.
can you yeah, I just can't believe that people are doing that. And so can you describe what you'd see in your backyard, like someone who isn't going to have a chance to go online and look at it? And then also how much time that takes and what your involvement is?
Okay, so in my backyard, back to kind of the hardware. So it's designed to be functionality wise, equipment wise, it's fairly similar to aquaponics.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, in my case, I have an upper tank and a sump tank, and there's a pump in the sump tank that runs on a timer every 3 hours. Well, actually, I'll get into the timing later, probably not at all, but periodically the water pumps from the sump tank up into the upper tank, and as the water fills up in the upper tank, it overtops it runs up through a pipe that pours the water into, it's actually a compost bin. And I'll get to the compost bin in a minute and what it does. But then from there, it flows through the grow bed where the soil is, where the plants are. Now, this is one of the places where the structure is a little bit different from aquaponics, whereas aquaponics has a media that has a really high flow rate. You've got large pore spaces between the particles.
Uh-huh.
The water, they tend to do a flood and drain. So you fill it up and then drain it down and then fill it up and then drain it down. Because I actually have soil, the particulate sizes are a whole lot smaller. And so while I can't, if I tried flooding it constantly like that, it would just be waterlogged all the time. But one of the advantages of it is whereas aquaponics can't do wicking, the pores are too big for the water to wick up into the upper layers, mine will actually do that. Especially as the soil breaks down and the particulate sizes get smaller and smaller, it will actually wick the water up into the upper levels of the soil. So instead of having a flat bed that does flood and drain, I actually have a sloped bed, put about a 2% slope on the bed. I think anything up to about 5% would work. And the water flows in one side, flows along the bottom of the soil, wicking up into the soil, and then draining out the far side. And so I run the water for only about 15 to 30 minutes, depending on time of year and various other factors. And so what I try and do is I try and push as much water in there as I can to kind of force the water, not just wicking, but actually saturate the soil and then drain it down. And that pushes the bad air. As you have organic matter that's breaking down, it uses up the oxygen in the soil. And so this pushes that bad air out and keeps the soil production aerobic, keeps it healthy, keeps it functioning. So, I mean, that's the basics of it. In terms of what you would see in my backyard, one of the things that I've pushed for really hard is I was dating a woman at one point, and we went out to see a local aquaponics setup. I took her out with me to take a look at it, and on the way home, she said, "Wow, that was really cool, and there's no way we're building one in our backyard." It wasn't attractive enough. A lot of aquaponic systems that you see out there tend to be kind of industrial looking. You got a lot of white plastic, a lot of wiring that's running all over the place, and a lot of, just industrial looking plastic and metal equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried to do what I can to minimize that and try and bring the aesthetics to bear. And in a way of, my main way of doing that was to simplify the design wherever I could. So it made it a whole lot easier to hide the plumbing. The plumbing is almost exclusively hidden in my garden. You just don't see very much of it. I've got, my upper tanks are IBC totes. I've got 4 of them. And by the time it gets grown in, which will be fully grown in another month, maybe 2, these IBC totes will be overgrown with water spinach. And so you won't really even be able to see very well without looking carefully what's underneath them. It just looks like a big lump of green.
Oh, cool. So you're talking about those water catchment tanks with the metal, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's a white plastic tank that sits in a metal cage.
Mm-hmm.
And the water spinach is a plant that actually floats on top of the water and grows over the edge. And it's just ridiculously productive in the summer here. So it's a vine related to sweet potatoes. So, and it's edible green. So it's really a top producer here in the summertime.
Is that a big component of feeding your fish also?
It is, because the tilapia that I have in those tanks are omnivores. So they will eat mosquito larvae and guppies and other things that end up in the water. But they also, they really get the bulk of their diet from vegetation. And because the water spinach just floats on the top, they constantly work their way around and nibble the root system of the water spinach as it tries to grow. And any part of the leaves that fall into the water, they nibble those off instantly. And it's really funny. You go and look at a branch, a vine of the water spinach, and the leaf is half nibbled off right at the water line.
Huh.
Because the tilapia just love it.
That's awesome.
And I also try and grow in my sump tank. I try and keep duckweed growing. And then I can harvest that and put it up with the tilapia too. They love, of course, you have to have a lot of space to grow enough duckweed to fully feed your tilapia, because they'll gobble up, 2 weeks worth of growth in about 10 minutes.
Gotcha. So what else are you feeding them?
Basically just tilapia food.
Okay.
The local feed store. My eventual goal is to see if I can make something on my own that's not grain based.
Uh-huh.
The idea of feeding tilapia grain, but it's something that's doable right now. Back to what I was saying with the compost bin. So what I do is the first foot of the garden is actually a compost bin, and I put in any plant trimmings there, the solid waste from the tilapia, which aquaponics tends to struggle with, gets collected in this compost bin. The worms get in there and harvest, process it down into soil really, really rapidly. I've been having this year a really huge influx of black soldier fly larvae. Still trying to figure out the best way to see if I can harvest them to feed them to the chickens. But for right now, I just have thousands of them in the compost bin. And I put a pumpkin in there a week ago, and it was barely recognizable after 7 days.
Wow.
I sent my fiance over to take a picture of it to see what's going on. She looked directly at it and said, "Where is it?" And it was a whole pumpkin. It was just a little soft on the bottom when I put it in.
So does that mean that right now with the weather and those flies that your backyard is like kind of infested with flies?
No. These are black soldier flies.
Okay.
Have you heard? Are you familiar with black soldier flies?
Well, I hear about them, but I don't have firsthand experience with them. So
they don't infest. So the black soldier fly lives most of its life cycle as a larva.
Got it.
That is absolute voracious consumer of organic waste. They actually live when I flood the soil, they come up in the soil. So they're down even in just my soil.
Amazing.
And when they actually pupate, the adult is actually a wasp mimic. It's about an inch long, maybe an inch and a quarter, and they're black and they kind of look like a little wasp. But they don't have a sting. They don't even have a mouth. What they do is they find a mate and they mate, they lay their eggs, and then they die. And from what I understand, nobody's entirely sure where they go, because even with just thousands of them in my 2 functioning compost bins, along with the soil, at no point do I ever see more than, I think I've actually seen like a half dozen flying around at one point.
Huh.
But they don't swarm. They're not pests. They just come out, do their business, and go away. I think a lot of them just fly off into the neighborhood. I really don't know what's happened to them. And I was reading something online by someone who was was a FAQ on a black soldier fly page, and somebody was asking the same question about infestation, and he says, "I've never seen more than 2 or 3." And maybe that's just an indication of just how many of these things I have, that I've seen a half dozen in one day. but at no point have I ever seen 100 of them. I've never seen them swarming. I've never seen them being pests.
Gotcha. Well, it sounds like that would be a good food for your chickens.
It really is. The larvae are actually, when they decide that it's time to pupate, they kind of self-harvest. They crawl up out of the substrate that they're in, and you've got various, like Biopod, for example, is one product that counts on this fact. And so there's a place for them to live, and then it's got these little ramps for them to self-harvest right into a bucket so you can feed your chickens.
Brilliant.
I haven't quite figured out how to do that in my garden yet, but I will be poking at it at some point and see if I can come up with something.
That's so cool.
As for the rest of the garden, like I said, aesthetics is something that's really important. So I built the garden out of wood, and it's basically, in order to be as efficient as possible in the space, I actually set it up, the top of the bed's up about 3 feet. So I've actually got the chickens are living underneath the garden in my yard. And this protects them from the brutality of the Arizona sun through the summer. They've got good shade, and they can get up under the tanks. Enjoy being under something that's a large thermal mass that's temperature controlled.
Mm-hmm.
So, the goal at every single level is to try and be as efficient as possible. So yeah, I made it out of wood. I'm an okay carpenter. I'm not a carpenter by profession, but I'm learning.
Well, it's definitely beautiful and amazing to look at. That's for sure.
Was hoping for that. I was actually originally thinking that, I would build each of the 4 beds in a slightly different style to kind of demonstrate what can be done. But considering that I'm in a rental property and the design that I've got right now ended up looking nicer than I thought it would, even is sectional and easy to remove when it's time to move out. I just stuck with the same design. So it turned out well. I'm happy with it.
Wow. So I guess I'm curious about what else you're growing in there.
You mean about what am I growing in the garden?
Yeah. So it's all kind of working in systems like that. And then downstream, you've got different greens growing. Is that right?
I have lots more than greens because it's soil. I'm not limited to things that aquaponics is limited to. So I did a little experiment with potatoes. Unfortunately, I started a little late and the summer heat got to me. And as soon as it started getting over 100 degrees, it just fried the potatoes, which sounds tastier than it was. So I replanted there with sweet potatoes in the same bed, which are actually, they love the heat. Those are doing really well. I've got a bunch of squash that's doing well right now. Chard handles the heat just fine. I had corn for a little bit, which I got a little bit of a late start on that again, but I got a modest harvest off of it. I'll replant in the fall, or in about a month actually. What else do I have? I have a lot of basils doing well. I've got some peppers. Some of them, it got really brutally hot the last couple of weeks, and so I've lost a couple of pepper plants. I've lost pretty much all of my tomato plants are not doing terribly well right now because I don't have any kind of a shade structure, and so I'll probably experiment next year with growing beans up a trellis to kind of provide some shade protection for tomatoes and some of the other stuff. Our like yard long beans apparently do very well in the heat here. Okra is just starting to take off. So right now it's actually the time of year right now that most people say you can't grow anything in Arizona. And so what I've got is either just starting to take off because it likes the heat, or it's just finished up its lifespan because it doesn't like the heat. So I'll be looking to start replanting in a couple of months here for the things for a fall garden. And, fall garden is going to be a lot of cold weather stuff. I can get, things that have a pretty fast turnaround. Like you can plant corn in late August and get a harvest before the frost hits things here. So
cool.
Yeah, Phoenix just has its own kind of a weird climate, but so far, because of the really, really high organic content of the soil, I found that certain plants absolutely thrive, and other plants just flounder. And the big one that flounders is I tried peanuts this year, and they like a loose sandy soil. So they grew up to about 3 inches tall, and they're still thinking about dying on me here. I think they're mostly done with that. But But anything that really likes that rich organic soil tends to do really well. Greens do well. Sweet potatoes just do phenomenal. Okra tends to do well. Squash, still kind of playing with getting squash right. I think a lot of it's variety. I've been getting some pretty good growth this year. So anyway, yeah, it's just
That's cool.
about anything, really.
I mean, I've seen some of the pictures of it, and I understand how it starts and how you're using the inputs from the fish and the compost and downstream. So you've got different beds. And then at what point are you having to, I mean, do you have to take out soil, and how does it work, towards the end of the system?
The way it typically works, are you familiar with the bacterially dominated versus fungally dominated soils concept?
Yes.
Okay, so what I found is that when I first build a system, it becomes fungally dominated for about 3 months, 2 to 3 months, as the decomposing mushrooms settle in and start decomposing the soil. They push the pH down. My tap water here is about 8.0. The fungus actually drops my pH of the water down to about 6.5. But as the mushrooms kind of settle into their lifestyle towards the end of their life and finish up, then it starts to become more bacterially dominated. And then the pH rises to about 7.6. And so what happens is most of our agricultural crops, the things that we grow as vegetables, are annuals. You've got annuals tend to do very well in a bacterially dominated soil that's got a little bit of a higher pH, that's being fed by nitrate. And so they tend to do really well in the actively breaking down soil. Now, one of the things that happens is when you first build a system, I've had this happen every time, I'm trying to find ways to reduce the soil growth curve, I guess, if for lack of a better term. What happens is, so if you take a plant and you plant it in wood chips, the plant's going to die just about guaranteed. The reason it does that is because as the fungus launches off, it needs to grow into its food source. In order to grow, it needs nitrogen, and it steals that nitrogen from the soil, and the plant has to have the nitrogen or it dies. Mm-hmm. The plant ends up in a nitrogen depleted state that it just can't survive. Now, of course, once the mushroom has completed its life cycle, it starts to rot, and it gives that nitrogen back. It becomes part of the ecosystem again. But that doesn't help the plant that's struggling. So that's one of the ways that mine actually does things a little bit differently, because of the fish that are in the tank, I'm getting this constant source of nitrogen from the water. And so as the water flows through, those mushrooms are snagging up all of the nitrogen that they can possibly find to try and push their growth into the wood. Now, having big chunky wood slows down that process a little bit. They still steal the nitrogen, but because I've got the nitrogen from the fish, the plants still get what they need. So for the first little bit, it's almost like an aquaponics system, because there's not enough soil in there to have a soil ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And so for about 2 to 3 months, the plants kind of struggle a little bit as they're basically living outdoors in aquaponics, which doesn't give them a lot. It doesn't necessarily give them all of the nutrients that they need. It doesn't give them there's a lot of immune system that comes from the soil organisms that really boost the plant's immune system. And so they're not necessarily getting that as that soil ecosystem is building. They're getting the nutrients that they need roughly, so that the growth tends to be a little slow, a little bit suppressed in the first couple of months. It still grows. Probably better than a lot of people would think, but having been doing this for a couple of years, I know what's possible, and it's a little slower. But once that soil starts to look like soil, then the plants just explode, because they've got this nutrient-rich, actively decomposing soil that is bacterially dominated, which meets the needs of most of the annual plants that we grow for vegetables. Uh-huh. And then as the soil ages, it gets broken down more and more. Now, what I'll do is I'll haul the compost. I actually empty the compost bins at the beginning of the bed about once a month, maybe once every 2 months. They fill up fairly quickly, and then I just scoop everything out and I top dress it around the garden, and it provides additional nutrients and additional fuel for the plants. But it does kind of get to a point where the soil has kind of broken down to the point where it's approaching normal yard soil. It's still very, very rich, but for some reason, at least in my first generation prototype, I haven't gotten there in my second, so it may function a little bit differently. But what I found is I could scoop it out and put it in like a container or top dress it as like a mulch around the garden, and you just get explosive growth outside the system. Inside the system kind of slow down. And so what I do is I'll take out up to 50% of the soil and replace it with more organic matter. I'll work in more branches and yard clipping, leaves, and whatever I mow the grass and put it in there, for example. And so, we'll just work in more material and let it go back to actively decomposing, and then you get a boost in plant production again. It's like I said, the plants seem to do well when it's actively breaking down.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. I think people, even if they weren't going to just focus on the system itself, but having a system that is utilizing fish and composting for the rest of their yard is pretty interesting.
The other thing that I haven't really touched on is the maintenance aspect. That's the place where it really got interesting. Is I had 2014, I had a garden that was a year old. My boss sent me for a 2-week training seminar in Indiana, and I didn't have anybody who could be out there daily gardening. So I just asked a friend to stick their head in and, every 2 to 3 days, and just make sure that nothing was running dry, nothing was flooding, nothing was overflowing. And she did. I mean, literally, she looked at it for about 20 seconds every 2 to 3 days, and then walked away. She never did anything for 2 weeks in June in Arizona in full sun. Everything just ran itself. I've really started with the question of, what labor needs to be done and who can do it that isn't me. So the fish are on an automatic fish feeder. The watering of the garden is on a timer. The pump runs every couple of hours to push the water through the garden beds and make sure that they stay watered. The sump tank has a float valve in it so that I can make sure that it stays full and doesn't run dry. One of the big sources of labor in aquaponics is you've got to test the water. The really big operations have equipment in there that tests it constantly. You're testing for pH, you're testing for nitrogen levels, you're testing for nutrient content. And when those numbers get off balance, you've got to fix it really quick because there's buffer in the system. What I found is that the living soil actually buffers those nutrients really, really well. And I've actually put a lot of biochar in the system this time around to see if I can increase that buffering capability. The biochar absorbs nutrients from the water, kind of like a carbon filter would, but it holds them in such a way that the biological organisms in the soil can just climb all over it and collect those nutrients and distribute them back out into the system. And so what happens is, like in aquaponics, if you get a fish that dies, it causes a nitrogen spike, which if you don't take care of it pretty quickly, can cause a massive die-off of the rest of the fish, which, is fairly catastrophic for the system. It throws everything off.
I think many, many beginners have experienced that.
Yes. And I've experienced it as well. My fish die-offs almost always happen because I had a power outage or a plug got kicked loose or something like that, and the aerator went out when it was 120 degrees.
Oh no.
Really, if my aerator stops running for 1 hour, I lose my fish.
Wow.
And so, eventually I'd like to get to a point where I'm on solar or something that's going to be a little bit more, this last one, I had one about a month and a half ago where the plug, which was plugged in the laundry room, just decided it wasn't plugged in anymore. It was still plugged in. It just lost its connection. I had to push it in a little bit farther, but it ran like that all night, and I lost about 30 fish.
Oh, no.
Fortunately, it wasn't all of my fish, and I had 100. I lost, a handful, so I probably still got 50 to 60 in there. They're still doing fine. So, but anyway, so you get those fish die off, and sometimes fish just die. Kind of tongue in cheek, but fish just like to die.
Yeah.
What'll happen is, because one of the disadvantages of my system is because the water's flowing through heavy organic matter, it actually has a color to it. When you first build a system, the color is dark and kind of cloudy and looks like a strong cup of coffee. But as the system kind of settles in and gets its filtering capabilities up and running, the first thing the water does is it loses its cloudiness. It becomes clear, but still kind of dark, like maybe a strong cup of tea, for example. And then eventually, as it really settles in and the soil matures, you get to a point where it's like a really, really weak cup of tea. But it never fully loses the color. And so if I have a fish that dies, certainly in the earlier stages of that, I'll never see the fish. They'll settle to the rot. If they float to the surface, then I can see them. I can fish them out and deal with it. But they don't always float to the surface. Especially with the water spinach in there, some of them float up and kind of get stuck on the bottom of the water spinach roots. And so what'll happen is I'll get these fish that die and start rotting in the tank, and the biological activity in the soil just collects those nutrients and processes them as if nothing ever happened.
Amazing.
I'll be fishing around with a net in my tank sometimes, and I come up with bones, and it's like, oh, well, that's unfortunate, but nothing else died. I lost one fish, and nothing else died. The other thing, as I kind of mentioned, is the pH. Is if you have a system that's got no buffering capability, you've got to really watch the pH, especially here. We get all of our, in the Phoenix area, we get all of our water from groundwater, and that has high load of nutrients, specifically calcium salts. And so what happens is you pour in water that has a pH of 8.0 to 8.2, the water evaporates off, the calcium salts stay behind. And, I did briefly at the very beginning of this, I did an aquaponics system, and I was pouring acid into the tank about every other day to the tune of several cups, just trying desperately to keep the pH below. It was trying to get up around 8.6, which is really not good for the plants or the fish.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas as soon as I put in the soil organisms actively balance the pH. And so I actually test the water about once every month, every 2 months maybe. And I always find it within the same range. It's always, when you first start off, it'll drop the pH a little bit as the mushrooms are growing, but then it settles up at about 7.5, 7.6, which is a really good range for both the plants that are growing and for the fish.
That's interesting. I wonder if a regular, traditional aquaponics setup, if the the aquatic food web, if that helps to manage the pH, or if they're having to adjust for it constantly.
They have to adjust for it constantly. They've got a really good source of water, like reverse osmosis or rainwater, then they're probably going to be okay on pH. But there's various things that can happen in the water that'll push the pH outside of that range. And it's something that it's not just the health of the plants and the health of the fish, but it's also the nutrients absorption. For example, nitrogen spikes, for example, are particularly toxic at high pH and not so dangerous at low pH. So if you have your fish in a tank that has a pH of, say, 6, and you get a big nitrogen spike, it's not going to be quite as dangerous for the fish as if it's sitting at 7.5 or 8,
mm-hmm.
or not. Some fish will deal with a 9 pH of 9 or so, but if if you get a nitrogen spike in there, it's particularly dangerous for them. But also there's different nutrients are absorbable in different pH ranges for plants, and it's really one of the functions of if you think about the soil evolutionary, what does soil do? I mean, soil primarily feeds off of plant matter that's falling. And if you want a lot of food, you need healthy plants that are going to produce a lot of plant matter, which means that they'll drop a lot of plant matter. So the soil has a vested interest in maintaining the chemistry of the soil. The soil organisms have a vested interest in maintaining the chemistry of the soil in such a way that the plants will thrive and do as well as possible.
Mm-hmm.
In this system where the water flows through and comes back around, those soil organisms do a very good job of maintaining the soil chemistry in such a way that the soil is maintaining the water chemistry.
Okay, so your system, at the end of it, after the soil absorbs as much water as it can, at the end, all that water is pumped back into the fish tank?
Yes.
Okay.
So the water flows from the sump tank, it pumps up to the upper tank, where it rises in the tank, flows through the pipe, drains down to the garden bed. It flows down through the garden bed from one end to the other because of the slope. And then there's a drain at the far end. And so the water drains out of the garden bed into the sump tank.
Gotcha. Are you interested in algae at all? I mean, a lot of people I've been hearing about are experimenting with feeding their fish algae. Do you know anything about that?
I was actually just talking with somebody about that the other day. I think that it might be a little bit of a tricky prospect in my system, because if you have aquaponics, what's going to happen is that you have large pore spaces in the growth media for the plants, or in some cases they have like the raft systems where there's no, the plants are putting their roots down into the water.
Mm-hmm.
In that type of a system, the algae just flows straight on through and comes back around. And there's certainly something there to be said about, feeding the tilapia algae, because tilapia are actually capable of filter feeding algae right out of the water.
Ah.
The problem in my system is the soil is much, much more effective at capturing absolutely everything that flows through it. I've got my short bed here is 24 feet long. The one that I'm currently building is going to be 40 feet long. And so any water that flows through there is going to flow through 40 feet of soil. And so it's going to be filled with biological organisms that are actively filtering everything that they can. And so the algae is going to not really get through.
It might have to be a separate little tank or something, but I wonder if...
I could grow it in a separate tank and then feed it to the fish, but my issue with that is that's more labor for me.
Yeah, for sure.
It's something that I would have to keep track of. The other thing is I'd have to time the feeding of the fish correctly. Once I get all four, I've got eventually going to have 4 garden beds with four upper tanks that all share a sump tank. And so what I'm working on trying to figure out right now is how to manage automatically the valves so that the pump, I've just got one pump that runs up into a bank of valves. And right now I'm manually switching the valves. Actually, right now I'm not manually switching the valves, but once I get the 3rd bed up, I will need to manually switch the valves so that it's flowing enough water into each of the beds. I've got the timer that I'm using has 8 channels on it, and it will flow. So I can basically flow each with 4 beds. I'll be able to flow to each bed twice a day, which actually works out pretty well because the organic soil holds water. It holds water a lot better than just about any hydroponic or aquaponic material other than coconut coir.
I mean, it holds it better, but you can't cover it with like any material. I think that, you're probably, do you know how much you're losing to evaporation or how much you're adding into it every day?
My system, I got a water meter that I hooked in line with my hose a couple of months ago, and it ran for 3 months before it died on me, which I'm kind of bummed about. But the last time, and so this is 2 beds running. Before it got really hot, it was using about 10 to 12 gallons a day of water.
Uh-huh.
When the water wicks up to the surface, it doesn't quite get all the way to the surface. And so it almost acts like a mulch barrier on the surface there. So it doesn't lose a lot of water from evaporation. Most of the water that it's losing is from evapotranspiration.
Uh-huh.
Once it gets hot here, because my tanks are out in the sun, they get a little bit of shading from the water spinach, but it's still not enough. Right now, nighttime lows are about 95 degrees.
Oh my God.
highs are 110, 115. And so what'll happen is my water temperature, tilapia are good to about 105, maybe as high as 110. I want to say it was 108 was the number I heard. So I try to keep it below 100, but if they're just dealing with ambient temperatures, they would easily rise over that threshold.
Uh-huh.
Actually have built an evaporative cooler for the water that sits on top of the tank and just flows the water through a wicking material, an old t-shirt actually, with a fan blowing on it. And so I'm getting the cooling from my tanks that keeps them down, when it's really this hot, it keeps them down to 85 to 90 degrees. I do that through water loss.
Right.
But even with that, still using, it just stopped at the end of November, and I ended up using, I think, 16 gallons a day using evaporative cooling.
That's amazing. Not much.
No, it's not. It's what a long shower is basically how much water it uses
Right.
every day. So I want to say I saw, and it was like a load of laundry is, depending on your washing machine, somewhere around 20 to 30 gallons.
Yeah.
Even if I was capturing my laundry water, I still wouldn't be using it all.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's so cool. Well, awesome. This is great information. I'm really curious, what are you, so you're an engineer. I didn't ask you anything about that, but do you want to talk about your personal work and how you ended up, or what your goals are with this?
That might be a whole other podcast. I've got some goals on that one. I am a civil engineer. I'm trying to find a way to make this work, something that I'm certainly open to consulting with people. If you're local, I can help build systems. That's kind of where I'm going with the business right now. Long term, what I'm hoping to do is revolutionize how we produce food in urban areas by focusing on the aesthetic aspects of a garden, something that, is not going to be an eyesore in your backyard. That's going to be, even your average soccer mom's going to say, hey, look at this. It's really cool. And then focusing on the labor saving aspect of it, something that you come home from a long day and got to head straight out and take the kids to soccer and dance recital, and everybody's sort of rushing around. You don't really have 2 hours a day to be out there watering and weeding and taking care of things. So having something that pretty well takes care of itself, and all you really got to do is plant it and harvest it, I think would be definitely a bit more attractive to a whole lot of people. People are using these big suburban backyards, making use of that urban sprawl for something productive. Then we start getting into a decentralized system of agriculture. We can find monetary incentives for people to produce more food than they can eat. If you've got a network of people maintaining it, you can use that same network of people to collect and sell the excess produce and give the benefits of that back to the homeowner. And so then you start to really create something that can make a change, making the world a better place. Climate change is another thing that people are interested in being a part of helping. And my garden is, according to my calculations and the best information I've been able to find, once I get my garden soil full and all of the beds built, I'll get all of the soil full, all of it running the way it's supposed to be running, I'm looking at sequestering about 1.8 tons of carbon in 1,000 square feet in my backyard. And I think that'll take 2 years, maybe 3 years. But if we assume it takes 2 years, it's like 1.8 tons doesn't sound like a lot. But you look at, our best carbon sequestration method right now is holistic range management, which scientific studies are coming in right now saying that it can sequester between 2 and 13 tons of carbon per acre per year, which is some really good numbers. But if you run the numbers on my 1.8 tons of carbon in 2 years and 1,000 square feet, it actually works out to be more like 39 tons of carbon per acre per year.
I was going to say, it's like a big difference. Wow.
Yeah. So it's something that works. It's my little backyard garden isn't going to make enough of a difference. But if I can work with a lot of people out there and help them get better nutritional, better quality, higher nutritional foods for their family, possibly even if they've got enough resources in terms of space and a little money up front to build it out a bit, and for the record, not counting the labor side, just the materials cost, I've got about, once I get this third bed built, I'll have about 350 square feet of garden space in my backyard. And it cost me in the neighborhood of about $4,500 in materials.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that was because I put chickens under it. You become a whole lot more efficient in materials when you don't build the whole thing an extra 1.5 feet tall so that you can run chickens underneath it. But anyway, so if you can help people have better food for their family, more convenient, because there's 0 food miles. You literally walk out your back door and go see what's for dinner tonight, possibly a little additional income. You're actually finding a way for people to make a real difference while improving their life, not having to give as much up. Then you start getting into incentives for people to start building this out. And once you get a network of enough people doing this, then you start sequestering some serious carbon. You're using a lot more vegetation with relatively low water use, so you can start cleaning the air. You can start reducing urban heat island effect because that sun is beating down on plant leaves, not on concrete. There's a whole lot of benefits that you can get if we start rolling this sort of thing out.
I really like it. I like the potential various business models too. I mean, that's something that people can be a part of. So it's like a good, I guess, a tribal spirit, which you could probably get going, and very cool. Well, the people who are reaching out to me seem to be people who are interested in exactly the type of thing that you're doing. They're trying to transform their backyard or a piece of land and do the right thing for our future.
Thanks for listening. Next week, we will visit Sam Lopez, an urban homesteader in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with amazing information to share about crop rotation, no-till, composting, and his experience farming in the middle of the city. I hope the Get in My Garden podcast has inspired you to continue your learning, to continue your hobbies, projects, and businesses related to natural farming, hydro and aquaponics, bees, fungi, soil and the soil food web, microbes, plants, and however you are involved in entertaining yourself in a way that benefits the earth and our future. And again, follow the show at Get in My Garden on Instagram to see pictures of what we discuss here and to learn about upcoming episodes. Also visit getinmygarden.com and make sure you sign up for the email list, which will soon include supplemental and special content or freebies from our guests, as well as articles or other interesting things I share with my close friends. I hope you'll subscribe to the Get in My Garden podcast wherever you listen from, and leave a positive review if you want to support the show.